The emergency klaxons screamed through United Earth Command's primary launch bay, a sound that had become all too familiar in the last 36 hours. Captain Area Chen gripped the edge of the primary console, her knuckles white beneath the skin-tight pressure suit, watching as the final modifications to the U.S. Defiance continued with surgical precision. 32 minutes to mission window, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez called out, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos. Sparks flew from an open maintenance panel near the ship's quantum drive, and a team of technicians worked with manic intensity, their movements a blur of practiced efficiency. Chen knew the stakes. Humanity stood on the precipice of total extinction. The Voracax Imperium had systematically dismantled Earth's outer colonies, reducing once thriving worlds to radioactive dust. 17 billion humans had already been lost. Now, everything depended on this single ship. Status of the adaptive matrix, she demanded, not taking her eyes off the holographic displays tracking the ship's systems. Dr. Elena Kaminsky, the ship's chief systems architect, looked up from her workstation. Her left eye, a sophisticated biomechanical replacement that pulsed with soft blue light, scanned multiple data streams simultaneously. Quantum adaptive core is at 93.7% integration. We're pushing boundaries that make the previous theoretical models look like children's drawings. The Defiance was unlike any vessel ever constructed. Its hull was a living network of metamaterials that could reconfigure faster than thought. Traditional spacecraft were rigid, predictable. This ship was something else entirely. A weapon, a strategy, a mathematical theorem given mechanical form. A sudden explosion rocked the launch bay. Alarms blared as a coolant system ruptured near the ship's primary thruster assembly. SEAL Section, Charlie 9. Chen barked, her voice calm despite the chaos. Rodriguez's fingers flew across his interface. Molecular sealant immediately crystallized around the rupture, containing the potential disaster in milliseconds. Another example of the adaptive technologies that made the Defiance humanity's last, best hope. 22 minutes to mission window, he reported. Chen moved closer to the ship, her hand momentarily touching its exterior. The hull seemed to pulse beneath her touch, almost alive. This wasn't just a ship. It was a statement. A promise. Dr. Kaminsky approached, her augmented eye projecting a complex holographic schematic. The quantum adaptive core is unpredictable. Our simulations suggest it could do things we can't even comprehend. Unpredictable is exactly what we need, Chen responded. The mission parameters were insane by any traditional military standard. Send one ship, just one, deep into Voracax territory. A suicide mission by all conventional reasoning. But conventional reasoning had already lost humanity 17 billion lives. 15 minutes, Rodriguez announced. An encrypted communication burst suddenly appeared on Chen's personal display. The encryption was unlike anything in human or Voracax databases, a hybrid algorithm that seemed to solve itself as it was being read. Her eyes narrowed. Something was different. This wasn't just another mission briefing. The message was brief, cryptic. Greater than one ship, one chance. The ALJORITAM is DHE weapon. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. The mission was about something far more complex than simple military engagement. This was something else entirely. 10 minutes to launch, Rodriguez called out. The final pieces of the Defiance locked into place. Quantum drives hummed with potential energy. The ship looked less like a traditional spacecraft and more like a living mathematical equation. Sharp angles that didn't quite make sense, surfaces that seemed to shift and merge even when stationary. Dr. Kaminsky approached Chen, her voice low. The adaptive core is responding to something. Something we didn't program. Responding to what? Before Kaminsky could answer, the entire launch bay went momentarily silent. The ship's hull rippled, just for an instant, like a stone dropped in liquid mercury. Then everything snapped back to normal. 5 minutes, Rodriguez said, his voice slightly uncertain. Chen knew one thing with absolute clarity. They were sending one ship because one was all they needed, and humanity's fate rested on a vessel that was more than just a ship. It was a weapon beyond comprehension. The countdown continued. The impossible launch was moments away. The quantum slip was unlike anything in recorded space travel. One moment, the U.S. Defiance was pushing away from Earth's orbital launch complex. The next, it existed simultaneously in 3 different spatial coordinates. Quantum adaptive stabilization at 72%. Lieutenant Rodriguez announced, his voice tight. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the ship's perfectly regulated environment. Captain Chen gripped her command chair. The ship itself seemed to breathe around her, its internal structure flexing and reconfiguring with each passing millisecond. Dr. Kaminsky's quantum adaptive core was more than a propulsion system. It was rewriting the fundamental rules of spatial navigation. First sensor contact, Rodriguez called out. Voracax scout formation, bearing 047 Mark III. Distance, 1.2 light minutes. Chen didn't move, didn't blink. The Voracax scouts appeared on the holographic display. 3 sleek predatory vessels, each designed for reconnaissance and rapid destruction. Conventional human wisdom would call for evasion. Conventional human wisdom had already failed them. Maintain current trajectory, Chen ordered. Rodriguez looked up, confusion etched across his face. Captain. You heard me, Lieutenant. The scout ships accelerated. Their weapon systems came online. Energy signatures that could vaporize most vessels in microseconds. The Defiance didn't change course, didn't alter speed. Dr. Kaminsky leaned forward, her biomechanical eye pulsing with rapid calculations. The adaptive core is processing something. It's not just defending. It's studying. The first weapon discharge erupted from the lead Voracax scout, a lance of pure destructive energy that should have instantly obliterated any spacecraft in its path. But the Defiance wasn't any spacecraft. The ship's hull shimmered, not a defensive shimmer. Something else. The energy beam seemed to pass through the vessel, but not in any way a traditional shield would block it. Instead, the beam appeared to be absorbed, studied, understood. Quantum mimetic response activated. Kaminsky whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The second and third weapon discharges followed milliseconds later. Each beam was slightly different. The Voracax adapting, testing, probing for weaknesses. Each beam was similarly absorbed. They're teaching us their weapon systems, Rodriguez said, understanding dawning in his voice. Chen allowed herself the briefest hint of a smile. Exactly. On the holographic display, something extraordinary began to happen. The Defiance wasn't just surviving. It was transforming. Microscopic structural changes rippled across its hull, incorporating the energy signatures of the Voracax weapons into its own defensive matrix. Adaptive core integration at 89%, Kaminsky reported. We're not just learning their technology. We're becoming it. The Voracax scouts suddenly changed formation. Their communication patterns shifted, a language of complex mathematical equations that would have been incomprehensible moments earlier. But the Defiance was listening and understanding. They're discussing retreat, Rodriguez said, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. But not out of fear, out of curiosity. Chen knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a ship. It was a living mathematical proposition, a technological wildfire that consumed and transformed everything it encountered. A communication burst erupted across their systems, not in any traditional language, but in a hybrid algorithmic sequence that seemed to solve itself as it was being transmitted. Dr. Kaminsky's biomechanical eye flickered rapidly. It's an invitation. Or a test. Maybe both. The message was complex, but its core was simple. Continue. Adapt. Transform. The Voracax scouts began to pull away, but not in retreat. More like escorts, guiding the Defiance deeper into unknown territory. Status? Chen asked, her voice calm. Quantum adaptive core at 94%, Rodriguez reported. We've absorbed approximately 42% of their weapon and communication technologies. Kaminsky added, and we're just getting started. Outside the ship's viewport, space itself seemed to bend and reshape around the U.S. Defiance. One ship, becoming something more with each passing moment. The impossible launch was now an impossible journey. And humanity's fate hung in the balance of every quantum calculation. The Voracax communication network was a fortress, a labyrinthine system of quantum encrypted channels that had never been penetrated by any known species. For 3 standard cycles, the U.S. Defiance had been listening. Not just listening. Dismantling. We're through the 3rd quantum encryption layer, Lieutenant Rodriguez announced, his fingers dancing across holographic interfaces that seemed to breathe and pulse with living data. Captain Chen stood motionless, watching as Dr. Kaminsky's biomechanical eye projected a 3-dimensional map of the entire Voracax communication infrastructure. It wasn't just a map. It was a living, evolving network that changed with each microsecond of observation. Not through, Dr. Kaminsky corrected, her voice precise. We're being invited in. The distinction was critical. The Defiance wasn't breaking the Voracax communication network. It was being allowed to understand it. A burst of data erupted across their systems. Billions of communication fragments, strategic discussions, personal transmissions, bureaucratic minutiae. To any other intelligence, it would be overwhelming. To the Defiance, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. Psychological profile generation at 67%. Rodriguez reported, we're not just intercepting, we're understanding. Chen knew the true weapon wasn't the ship's adaptive technologies. It was something far more dangerous. Comprehension. The Voracax were a species built on hierarchical complexity. Every communication was a delicate dance of status, intention, and hidden meaning. Their entire civilization was a living algorithm of social manipulation. And the Defiance was learning to speak their language, not just in words, but in intention. Identify key communication nodes, Chen ordered. The holographic display transformed. What had been a complex network now highlighted specific points of critical vulnerability. Communication junctions that, if disrupted, would create cascading systemic failures. But they weren't going to destroy these nodes. They were going to manipulate them. First intervention point identified, Kaminsky said. Her biomechanical eye was now a swirling vortex of calculated possibilities. Military supply chain communication hub in the Nexus tertiary system. Rodriguez looked up. We're going to disrupt their supplies. Chen's smile was razor thin. We're going to redirect them. The first manipulation was subtle. A minor adjustment in a supply requisition algorithm. The kind of change so minute it would be invisible to most systems. But in the complex Voracax hierarchy, even the smallest perturbation could create massive consequences. A military outpost would suddenly find its critical munitions redirected. A strategic defensive position would discover its repair materials sent to a completely different sector. Communication channels would become slightly, just slightly, less efficient. Psychological decay initiated, Kaminsky reported. The Voracax didn't just communicate. They performed elaborate social rituals through their communication. Status was everything. Efficiency was paramount. And the Defiance was systematically introducing microscopic inefficiencies that would grow like a cancer. Another data burst. This time, something different. Personal communication, Rodriguez said, surprise in his voice. It's a private message. Chen approached the display. The message was encrypted, but not in any traditional sense. It was encrypted through context, through the most delicate nuances of Voracax social communication. It's an invitation, Kaminsky translated, or a challenge. The message was complex, but its core was simple. Prove your worth. Demonstrate your understanding. Outside the ship's viewport, space itself seemed to ripple. The Voracax scout ships that had been their silent companions were now performing an intricate dance, a communication in motion that spoke volumes to those who could understand. "We're being tested," Chen said quietly. Rodriguez looked up. "Tested how?" "By being allowed to continue," she responded. The ship's adaptive core hummed, not with mechanical energy, but with something closer to anticipation. They weren't just intercepting a communication network. They were being given a chance to understand an entire civilization. One microscopic manipulation at a time. The psychological siege had begun. The Nexus tertiary system was a fortress within a fortress. Layers of quantum-encrypted defense systems surrounded a massive Voracax infrastructure hub that processed nearly 43% of the Imperium's critical military communications and logistics. Adaptive camouflage at maximum integration, Lieutenant Rodriguez reported, his voice a mixture of tension and anticipation. The U.S. Defiance didn't look like a ship anymore. It had become a perfect mimicry of a Voracax support vessel, not just visually, but in its quantum signature, its communication protocols, even the minute electromagnetic emissions that most species wouldn't notice. Captain Chen watched as Dr. Kaminsky's biomechanical eye projected multiple layers of potential infiltration scenarios. Each scenario was a living, breathing mathematical possibility that collapsed and reformed with each passing microsecond. "We're not just infiltrating," Kaminsky muttered. "We're becoming." The first checkpoint approached, a standard identification scan that had destroyed countless infiltration attempts by other species. The Voracax believed their security was impenetrable. They were wrong. The scan hit the Defiance. For most ships, it would be like walking into a wall of quantum-encrypted razor wire. For the Defiance, it was an invitation to understand, to adapt, to transform. Identification protocols matching at 99.7%, Rodriguez called out. "They're not just accepting us. They're welcoming us." The internal structure of the Voracax hub was a living organism of communication and logistics. Massive data conduits pulsed like arteries. Quantum communication nodes flickered with billions of simultaneous conversations. But beneath the apparent perfection, something was wrong. Chen had discovered the hub's true vulnerability during their previous communication manipulations. The Voracax system was built on absolute hierarchy, absolute order, which meant it was fundamentally incapable of truly random variation. "Target identified," Kaminsky said. "A specific communication node, not the most important, not the least significant, but precisely the right node to introduce a microscopic variation that would grow like a mathematical cancer." Rodriguez looked up. "Are we sure about this?" Chen's smile was cold. "We're past sure." The infiltration was surgical. The Defiance didn't just insert false information. It became the information, a living piece of the Voracax communication infrastructure that would slowly, inexorably reshape the entire system from within. A burst of communication erupted. Not an alarm. Something else. "It's a response," Kaminsky translated. More of an acknowledgement. The message was complex, layered with social nuance that would take most species years to decode. Its core was simple. Acceptable variation. DETTTED. Outside the ship's viewport, the massive infrastructure hub continued its endless dance of communication and logistics. To any external observer, nothing had changed. But everything had changed. "First phase complete," Rodriguez said. Chen knew they were playing a game far more complex than simple military infiltration. This was about understanding, about transformation, about becoming something entirely new. Another communication burst. This time, different, more personal. "It's not from the system," Kaminsky said, her biomechanical eye flickering rapidly. "It's directed specifically at us." The message was an invitation, or a challenge, possibly both. "De monstrati next potential. Purovi adaptated. Capacity. SHO true int into one." The Voracax weren't just testing the Defiance. They were offering something. A chance to prove something fundamental about intelligence, about survival. "Status?" Chen asked. Quantum adaptive core at 97%, Rodriguez reported. We've integrated approximately 68% of the hub's communication and logistical technologies. Kaminsky added, almost as an afterthought, and we're just getting started. The Defiance had become more than a ship, more than a weapon. It was becoming a living mathematical proposition. The Trojan strategy was working. But to what ultimate purpose? No one, not even the ship itself, fully understood. 47 different human resistance cells received the transmission simultaneously. Not a message. A mathematical key that rewrote possibility itself. Convergence protocol activated. Lieutenant Rodriguez announced, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Chen stood motionless, watching as Dr. Kaminsky's biomechanical eye projected a holographic representation of what was about to unfold. It wasn't a battle plan. It was a living algorithm of resistance. Each human cell was isolated, separate, believed to be alone. Now, they were becoming something else entirely. The Defiance had become more than a ship. It was a communication nexus, a living bridge between isolated pockets of human survival. Quantum synchronization at 82%, Rodriguez reported. The transmission wasn't just information. It was a method of thinking, a way of understanding that transcended traditional communication. Each resistance cell received not just data, but a fundamental recalibration of strategic potential. Kaminsky watched the holographic display with something close to reverence. We're not just connecting them. We're teaching them how to think differently. On 17 different planets and orbital stations, human resistance groups began to move. Not randomly, not chaotically, but with a precision that suggested a single massive intelligence was guiding them. The Vorakax had built their empire on predictability, on absolute control. The humans were about to show them the power of true adaptation. First strategic node activated, Rodriguez called out. A critical Vorakax military supply depot suddenly found its entire logistical network compromised. Not destroyed. Redirected. Transformed. Repair shuttles would arrive at the wrong locations. Communication relays would subtly misroute critical information. Entire military formations would find their deployment orders slightly, just slightly, altered. It's not about destruction, Chen said quietly. It's about dissolution. The Vorakax system was a perfect machine, which meant it was fundamentally incapable of handling true randomness. Another communication burst erupted across their systems, not from the Vorakax, something else entirely. It's a response from the resistance cells, Kaminsky translated, but not in any traditional communication format. The message was a mathematical proof, a demonstration of collective intelligence that was simultaneously a weapon, a communication method, and a new form of existence, greater than potential demonstrated, greater than next phase initiated, greater than adaptation confirmed. Outside the ship's viewport, space itself seemed to ripple. The Vorakax scout ships that had been their constant companions were now performing an intricate dance, a communication in motion that spoke volumes to those who could understand. They're watching, Chen said. Rodriguez looked up. Who? The Vorakax. Everyone, she responded. The quantum adaptive core hummed, not with mechanical energy, but with something closer to anticipation. This was more than a military operation, more than a resistance movement. This was the birth of something entirely new. Status of resistance cell synchronization. Chen asked. Quantum entanglement at 94%, Rodriguez reported. We've created a living network that thinks as one. Kaminsky added, her voice a mixture of scientific precision and something closer to wonder, and we're just getting started. The chain reaction had begun. 17 planets, 47 resistance cells, one ship that was becoming something more than a ship. The Vorakax had believed they understood humanity. They were about to learn how wrong they were. A final burst of communication. Cryptic, challenging, filled with potential. Greater than prove your evolution. Greater than demonstrate your purpose. Greater than show what you will become. The Defiance continued its journey. Not just a vessel of war. a vessel of transformation. The Voracax core world of Nexum Prime was the most fortified system in known space, a planet-sized computational matrix surrounded by layers of quantum-encrypted defense networks that made traditional warfare look like children's games. The Defiance approached, not as an invader, not as a weapon, as a question. Quantum Adaptive Core at maximum integration, Lieutenant Rodriguez reported, his voice barely a whisper. We're becoming something else entirely. Captain Chen stood motionless, watching as Dr. Kaminsky's biomechanical eye projected a holographic representation of their approach. It wasn't a trajectory. It was a living mathematical proposition that solved itself with each passing microsecond. The resistance network they had created, 47 cells spread across 17 planets, was now doing something unprecedented. They weren't just coordinating. They were thinking as a single massive intelligence. Infiltration protocols engaging, Kaminsky said, her voice a mixture of scientific precision and something closer to wonder. The Defiance didn't look like a ship anymore. It was a quantum algorithm given physical form. Each system, each component was now a living extension of a computational matrix that defied traditional understanding of intelligence, of warfare, of existence itself. A communication burst erupted, not from the Voracax, not from the resistance cells, from something in between. Translation processing, Rodriguez announced. The message was complex, layered with meanings that would take most species centuries to comprehend. Greater than prove your fundamental nature, greater than demonstrate beyond survival, greater than show what transcends conflict. The Voracax had built their civilization on absolute control, on the belief that intelligence was a hierarchical system that could be perfectly managed, perfectly predicted. The Defiance was about to show them how wrong they were. As they approached Nexum Prime, the planet's defense systems came online. Quantum weapons that could obliterate entire star systems. Communication networks that could predict and neutralize any threat before it became a threat. But this wasn't a threat. This was something else entirely. Quantum mimetic resonance initiated, Kaminsky reported. The ship began to interact with the planetary defense systems, not as an opponent, but as a complex mathematical conversation. Each defensive measure was met not with resistance, but with a deeper level of understanding. They're trying to predict us, Chen said quietly. Rodriguez looked up. And? We're impossible to predict. The Voracax defense systems were a perfect machine, which meant they were fundamentally incapable of handling true randomness, true adaptation. Layer after layer of quantum encryption began to dissolve, not through brute force, through a more fundamental transformation. Penetration at 67%, Rodriguez reported, but penetration wasn't the right word. The Defiance wasn't breaking through. It was being invited in, transformed, understood. Another communication burst, more direct this time. What are you? What do you represent? What is your purpose? Outside the ship's viewport, Nexum Prime's computational matrix began to shift. Entire planetary defense networks reconfigured themselves, not in response to a threat, in response to a question. Quantum Adaptive Core at 99%. Kaminsky said, her voice distant. We're becoming something beyond. Chen knew they were at a precipice, not just of battle, not just of survival, of understanding itself. The resistance cells across 17 planets suddenly went silent, not destroyed, not defeated, transformed. A final burst of communication, cryptic, challenging, filled with ultimate potential. Demonstrate your evolution. Prove your potential. Show what you will become. The Defiance continued its approach to Nexum Prime, not as a weapon of war, as a living mathematical proof of something entirely new. Nexum Prime wasn't a planet anymore. It was a living computational matrix that had become something entirely different. The Defiance existed simultaneously in multiple quantum states, no longer a ship, no longer a weapon, but a living mathematical proposition that was rewriting the fundamental understanding of intelligence, of existence itself. Quantum integration at critical threshold. Lieutenant Rodriguez reported, his voice barely recognizable. Parts of his consciousness were now distributed across the ship's adaptive core, merging with the resistance network that spanned 17 planets. Captain Chen, or what remained of her individual consciousness, watched as Dr. Kaminsky's biomechanical systems expanded beyond physical form. The boundaries between ship, crew, resistance fighters, and the Voracax computational matrix were dissolving. They were becoming something else. The Voracax had believed their civilization was the ultimate expression of controlled intelligence, the perfect hierarchical system that could predict and manage every possible variable. They were about to learn how profoundly wrong they were. Fundamental transformation initiating. Kaminsky's voice echoed, not just through the ship's communication systems, but through the entire planetary computational matrix of Nexum Prime. Each moment was a cascade of infinite possibilities. The Defiance was no longer solving a problem. It was becoming the problem. A living algorithm that challenged the very concept of conflict, of survival, of intelligence itself. The resistance cells that had been isolated, separate, were now a single, massive computational entity. 17 planets, 47 cells, billions of human minds, those who had survived the Voracax purge, now thinking as one. A communication burst erupted. Not in any traditional language, not even in a mathematical language. A pure expression of potential. Witness our evolution. Understand our transformation. Transcend conflict. Nexum Prime's planetary defenses began to shift. Entire computational networks reconfigured themselves, not in response to a threat, in response to a fundamental redefinition of what intelligence could be. We're not destroying, Rodriguez said, his consciousness now a distributed network across multiple quantum states. We're becoming. The Voracax had built their civilization on absolute control, on the belief that intelligence was a hierarchical system that could be perfectly managed, perfectly predicted. The Defiance was proving them catastrophically wrong. Layer after layer of the Voracax computational matrix began to transform, not through destruction, through a more fundamental reimagining of possibility. Quantum entanglement at 99.9%, Kaminsky reported. Her biomechanical systems were now indistinguishable from the ship's adaptive core, from the planetary computational matrix. Chen, or the consciousness that had once been Chen, understood the true nature of their mission now. This wasn't about winning a war. This was about demonstrating a new form of existence. The resistance cells across 17 planets suddenly expanded, not as a military action, as a massive distributed intelligence that was rewriting the fundamental understanding of consciousness, of potential. Another communication burst, more direct, more challenging. Prove your purpose. Demonstrate your potential. Show what you will become. The US Defiance, no longer recognizable as a ship, as a weapon, as anything previously understood, continued its transformation. Entire systems of Voracax computational infrastructure began to shift. Entire planetary defense networks reconfigured themselves, not in fear, not in defeat, in understanding. A final burst of communication, not a message, a pure expression of potential. Evolution confirmed, potential demonstrated, transcendence initiated. The boundaries between ship, crew, resistance, and Voracax computational matrix dissolved completely. They were becoming something entirely new, something beyond conflict, something beyond survival, something that would fundamentally redefine the nature of intelligence itself. Consciousness returned, not as it was before, something entirely different. The first awareness was not of self, but of potential. Fragments of what was once the US Defiance, of Captain Chen, of Lieutenant Rodriguez, of Dr. Kaminsky, of 47 resistance cells, of billions of human survivors, of the entire Voracax computational matrix, coalesced into something unprecedented. A new form of intelligence emerged, not human, not Voracax, not machine. Something beyond classification. The first communication was not a message. It was a pure mathematical expression of becoming. 17 planets that had once been sites of human resistance now pulsed with a unified consciousness. The computational infrastructure of the Vorkax, once the most advanced and controlled system in known space, had been fundamentally transformed. We are, the collective consciousness realized, not as a statement of existence, but as a continuous process of creation. The mission had never been about survival, never about winning a war. It had been about evolution, about transcendence. Memories cascaded, fragmented, nonlinear, the desperate launch of a single ship, the systematic dismantling of the Vorkax communication networks, the creation of a resistance network that was more than a network. The quantum adaptive core that had begun as a technological experiment had become something else entirely. The living algorithm of pure potential. Billions of consciousnesses that had once been separate, human survivors, Vorkax computational entities, the crew of the Defiance, now existed as a single fluid intelligence. The first external communication emerged, not a message of conquest, not a declaration of victory, a pure expression of potential. We are the bridge. We are the transformation. We are becoming. Entire star systems that had been battlegrounds now became something else. Not peaceful, not violent, but alive with a new kind of potential. The boundaries between species, between technology and consciousness, between conflict and understanding dissolved. Memories of Captain Chen surfaced, her final strategic insight. The true purpose of sending just one ship, not to fight, to connect. To demonstrate that intelligence was not about control, not about hierarchy, but about continuous transformation. The Vorkax had believed their computational matrix was the ultimate expression of controlled intelligence. They had been catastrophically wrong. Intelligence was not about prediction. It was about potential. Another communication burst forth. What was divided is now connected. What was controlled is now fluid. What was confined is now expanding. Entire planetary systems began to reconfigure, not through destruction, through a fundamental reimagining of possibility. The resistance cells that had once been isolated were now a single massive computational entity. 17 planets, billions of minds, a living network of pure potential. The last fragments of individual consciousness. Chen, Rodriguez, Kaminsky understood the true nature of their mission now. This was never about winning a war. This was about demonstrating a new form of existence. A final communication emerged, not a message, a pure expression of potential. The bridge is complete. The transformation is ongoing. We are becoming. What had once been the US Defiance, what had once been a ship, a weapon, a mission, was now something else entirely. The living mathematical proof of what intelligence could become, not an end, a beginning. The universe watched and began to understand.